Hello, my name is Joseph Stramondo, and I am an associate professor of philosophy and director of the Institute for Ethics and Public Affairs at San Diego State University, where I specialize in bioethics and neuroethics. And I'm going to talk a bit today about a project that I've been working on for a while that is called The Distinction Between Curative and Assistive Technology, where I will, not surprisingly, try to work out a theoretical distinction between curative and assistive technology so that folks can get more clarity on which is which and why. So, this project isn't actually a project that focuses on an ethical problem. It's prior to the ethical problem. The motivating question that got me to start thinking about this is an ethical problem. And that is this question of whether or not we as a society or as technologists ought to prioritize technology that is aimed at curing disability or aimed at assisting disabled people vis-a-vis assistive technology. Okay. And there has been sort of controversy about this question in the past, and to some degree, even conflict between technologists and disabled people. Okay. So there's this common view, I think, that most people hold, whether we are talking about folks doing basic science or engineers or even just your everyday person on the street. And that common view is that when it's possible, it's better to cure a disability rather than merely provide assistive technology. Okay? And so the reasons around that have to do with the idea that you would eliminate more suffering in a more permanent way. It might be seen as more cost effective. It might be seen as more fair to the interests of non disabled people in various ways. But that's sort of what we would think of as the most common way to think about this problem of prioritization. Okay. However, there are a vocal majority of disabled people and disabled activists, or vocal minority, I guess, that hold the opposite view, that say that it's actually better to accommodate a disabled person with environmental modifications and assistive technology than it is to try to cure their disability. Okay. And so, what they mean usually when they say better is that it can eliminate difficulty or disadvantage or suffering without at the same time reproducing social stigma about disability being unwanted or unnatural or undesirable in some ways. It also regards disability as a valid identity to be sort of embraced and celebrated with disability pride rather than as a problem to be fixed. Okay. And so there is this tension, okay, between sort of disability studies scholars, disability activists, and most people's common thinking about how to prioritize curative versus assistive technology. Okay, so this talk actually isn't about that. It's not about the ethics of prioritizing cure or prioritizing assistive technology. Rather, what it's about is getting clarity on what actually should count as cure or what actually should count as assistive technology in the first place. So, this is the prior problem, the metaphysical problem that we have to solve before we can even have a discussion about which one to prioritize, curative or assistive technology. First, we have to decide what is curative versus assistive technology. And so there's some clear cases I think that most people would agree on, and those include things like an antibiotic being curative, right? Or chemotherapy being curative. Whereas something like, in contrast, a wheelchair would be assistive technology, or a screen reader that blind people use on their computer, on their cell phone. right? That would be a clear case of assistive technology. It doesn't cure anything, okay? But there are some hard cases, I think, okay, that blur this line between what counts as a cure and what counts as AT, or assistive technology. Those include things like the cochlear implant that has been developed to restore hearing, or at least partial hearing, to folks that are deaf, right? There's also a novel gene therapy that's being used to treat achondroplasia, which is a form of dwarfism that accelerates bone growth in children. Okay, and then also there is sort of neurotechnologies like bidirectional brain-computer interface technology, which is going to be sort of the hard case that I'm sort of focusing on mostly today. Okay. So I'm just going to quickly go over this slide. I'm assuming most folks in this conference are going to be more or less familiar with the current usages and the possible future uses of BBCI. But right now we can use BCI for things like deep brain stimulation, for Parkinson's disease and tremor. Okay, it can also be used for psychiatric conditions like depression. It can be used for spinal cord injured people so that they have the ability to control a cursor on a computer monitor or a mechanical arm. Okay, so these are the uses that we have currently succeeded at with brain computer interface technology. Okay, in the form usually of a chip that is embedded in someone's brain that reads brain signals and then transmits them via wires or Wi-Fi. Okay. Now there are aspirational goals for BCI, or perhaps bidirectional BCI, and those future uses might include restoring a spinal cord injured person's bladder control or bowel control, or controlling prosthetic limbs that actually have sensation to touch, or maybe even bypassing spinal cord injuries entirely to reanimate someone's limbs or entire regions of their body with BBCI, with full sensation, okay? Or maybe somebody has a brain injury or a stroke, and so you can bridge the gap and sort of skip over the lesion on the brain by using BBCI perhaps in the future, okay? And so these kinds of future uses especially challenge the typical distinction and make less clear the typical distinction between what counts as curative and what counts as assistive technology, right? Are these uses of BBCI better understood as a cure for some disability, whether it's Parkinson's or spinal cord injury or brain injury? Or is it better understood as some kind of assistive technology that a disabled person uses but nevertheless remains disabled? So, my motivating question is what is it about these paradigmatic cases of, let's say, an antibiotic or a wheelchair that make them paradigmatic? And how can we use these defining features that make them paradigmatic to help us clarify harder cases like cochlear implants or BBCIs? Okay, so my thesis that I'm arguing for is that we can make this distinction more clearly by saying that assistive technology is any technology that confers what I call relational narrative group identity of disability on the user, in the way that curative technology does not confer relational narrative group identity of disability on the user. So here are some competing views. I want to sort of clear the way for my theory before I get into what I mean exactly when I say confers disability identity. Okay? An alternative competing view to what I'm going to lay out for you in a few moments is that curative technology restores someone to normal function whereas assistive technology doesn't. Okay, and this is pretty intuitive, and I think it works pretty well for the paradigmatic cases, right? Something like an antibiotic, right? It restores normal function. If somebody has a bladder infection and they take an antibiotic, then one way of thinking about what the antibiotic does is it restores their normal function of their bladder by taking on and taking out the infection. Okay, or if somebody has pneumonia, the same thing, right? It restores the normal function of the lungs. Okay, whereas normal function is conceived of as there's a philosopher named Bourse who defined it in these terms that was later borrowed by Norman Daniels, another philosopher. And the way to think about normal function here is the absence of disease. And diseases include deformities, disabilities that result from trauma, and they are sort of deviations from the natural function or functional organization of a species typical member. Okay, and so something like a dysfunctional nose would count as a lack of health in this case, right? Since noses have normal species functioning and normal functional organization, or simply normal anatomy, anything that deviates from that is going to be considered a diseased nose. Okay, and so what curative technology does is it restores normal function in this very broad sense, whether you're talking about lungs with an antibiotic or you're talking about a deviated septum with a surgery. Okay, it restores the mode of how our bodies work, the specific ways in which it functions to accomplish a task, as well as the level of function at which our bodies operate, or the efficiency with which it accomplishes a particular kind of task, right? The efficiency at which our lungs work to, oxygenate our blood and so on and so forth. Okay. So, in contrast, this theory says that assistive technology restores the level of function of someone's body, but by way of a different mode. Okay? And so the level of function, again, is the efficiency or efficacy of function, whereas the mode of function is the way in which the task is accomplished. And so we might say something like, well, something like an antibiotic that that cures someone's pneumonia, restores the mode and the level of function to someone's lungs, okay, such that they are back to normal again. Whereas a wheelchair, right, does not do this, right? It doesn't restore someone's mode of function because that would mean that they would walk again, right? But perhaps it gets them at least closer to their level of function. In other words, they can still mobilize. They can still get from point A to point B in more or less the same amount of time, sometimes faster, right? You don't see it right now, but I actually use a power wheelchair. And there are times when I get across, my very large college campus much more quickly and efficiently than someone using organic legs, right? And so the level of function of mobility, in some contexts anyway, is actually higher for someone using assistive technology. Okay? And so AT restores level of function to normality, or at least close, but by way of a different mode. And so this is sort of one distinction that people have tried to draw between assistive and curative technology. But I want to challenge that, right? I want to say that these hard cases actually don't allow for this theoretical intervention. Okay? So imagine for a minute a hypothetical future use of BBCI in which somebody with a high level spinal cord injury, a quadriplegic, right, is implanted with a BBCI that bypasses their spinal cord injury and fully reanimates all of their limbs and other body parts from below their point of injury. Okay? It skips right over the break. So, in addition to this, all of the mechanical and electrical components of the BBCI are embedded within the person's body so that it is entirely unapparent to an outside observer. You can't see it, right? And then finally, we'll say, just for the sake of argument, that this new technology is completely reliable, never breaks down, functions without any kind of maintenance, and it is equipped with batteries with a lifespan that's greater than that of any humans. And so you just sort of set it and forget it, as they used to say in the infomercials, right? So if such a technology existed, it would produce a really counterintuitive result, right? Because remember, what this theory of assistive versus curative technology says is that assistive technology restores someone's level of function, but by a different mode, whereas curative restores both the level and mode of function, right? And so the counterintuitive result of this hypothetical BBCI would be that we would have someone who would be a disabled person, right? Because we would count this as a assistive technology because it restores their level of function, but by a different mode, right? Because we don't have hardware in our bodies. We're not born with that, right? It's kind of like the deviated septum that Boris was talking about, Norman Daniels were talking about, right? That is an abnormal mode of function to have hardware in our bodies, okay? And so it would be akin, according to this theory, to something like a wheelchair, right? As being assistive technology. But that's really bizarre to think of it being an assistive technology that doesn't cure disability, to have this kind of hypothetical BBCI. Because it would mean that a person would have this kind of device implanted in them, and they wouldn't experience any kind of impairment, right? And they wouldn't be discriminated against by others for being disabled because it would be completely non apparent from the outside. And yet, we would have to classify it as an assistive device and not something that actually cured their spinal cord injury. That's kind of strange. They weren't cured, and yet they don't experience disability in any way, shape, or form. The second competing view that I think doesn't quite work says that a curative technology is part of a person's body, whereas an assistive technology is an external device. Okay? And there's a lot of intuitive appeal to this too, right? And this might get around the problem of the hypothetical BBCI that we just talked about, right? Maybe the distinction isn't about mode and level of function, but it's just that the BBCI that we were just talking about is internal to them, right? Whereas the wheelchair is external. And so if it's internal and non-apparent, then that means that it must just be a curative device and part of someone's body. Whereas an assistive device is external. And that's the distinction here, okay? So I don't think that quite works either, right? Because while there are a variety of tools that are separate from the body, okay, like someone's wheelchair or screen-reading device or something like that, it's really hard to determine when something actually is incorporated as part of someone's body and when it is not, right? So something like a transplanted kidney, right? That is incorporated to someone's body, and so we could think of that perhaps as a curative technology rather than as an assistive device, right? But there are other kinds of technologies where it's much less clear, okay? And so relying on incorporation to make this distinction doesn't settle much because it takes something to be incorporated in a way that it is itself sort of a thorny issue, right? There's lots of people that use technologies that talk about the ways in which that technology comes to feel as if it was part of them, right? When you are first learning to use chopsticks, right? at least in the West. It's not something we grew up using. It can be very difficult at first, right? It doesn't feel like it's part of you. It's very alien to you. It's unwieldy. But the more you use the chopsticks, the better you get at it, and the more it sort of becomes a part of you in a sense, right? The more it becomes so thoughtless to be able to just sort of pick up your piece of sushi as you would with a fork. It becomes part of you where you can sort of reach down and you don't think to yourself, the tip of the chopstick is now touching the piece of sushi. Rather, you think to yourself, I am touching the piece of sushi once you get to that level of chopstick usage, right? It's the same thing for a wheelchair user, right? It becomes, in a sense, part of their body, where you're pulling into a tight space on a city bus, right? And if you use a wheelchair enough, you're not thinking to yourself, my wheel is going to bump that person's foot. You're thinking, I am going to bump that person's foot. Okay? And so this raises this whole other complex debate on what counts as bodily incorporation for a tool, right? And so it doesn't actually solve anything. So rather than trying to pick that up and solve that very difficult philosophical nut, I propose that we can solve the problem by talking about the ways in which certain kinds of technology have cultural meaning. Okay? And the kind of cultural meaning these kinds of technology have are a meaning that actually confers disability identity on the user of that technology. Okay? And so the way I came up with this idea, excuse my dog, please. The way I came up with this idea is by reading certain accounts of assistive technology that basically defined it in terms of being technology that is for disabled people in some sense. Okay? So to just sort of quote from one paper, Ladner in 2010, he says, all technology is assistive, making tasks possible or easier to do, right? My laptop is assistive in this sense, okay? Nevertheless, the moniker assistive technology has come to mean specialized technology for persons with disabilities, right? So while in a very broad sense, my laptop might be assistive, it's not assistive in any meaningful way, in the same way that you might characterize my wheelchair as assistive technology, right? Because my wheelchair is a specialized technology for disabled people in a way that a laptop is not. It's for everybody, right? So here's another quote that kind of gets at that same notion, but in this case talking about BCI technology, okay? This technology, BCI, may therefore eventually offer almost everyone a way to move objects at a distance by exercising cognitive control of a mechanical device. At that point, BCIs may be seen less as an assistive technology for disabled people and more as a tool like the internet, which can benefit all users. So here again, we see this distinction between an assistive technology that's for disabled people and a mere tool like the internet or like my cell phone or like my laptop, which can benefit everyone. And so here's this idea that is sort of the starting point of my theoretical intervention, that what assistive technology is any technology that is for disabled people. But what exactly does that mean? What does it mean for technology to be for disabled people? So another way to put that question is to ask, why is assistive technology only for disabled people, right? Why is it that a wheelchair is only for disabled people? Why don't other people use them, right? I remember, a while back when segways started gaining popularity, and we saw people doing. I live in San Diego, and so there's these city tours, right, of people going around, zooming around downtown with their segways. And it occurred to me, well, that's just a wheelchair that you use when you stand up. That technology has been around forever. What's the big deal? Why don't people just use wheelchairs to zoom around downtown if they don't want to walk, right? And the answer to that is because wheelchairs are stigmatized. They are for disabled people. They are marked off as assistive devices and not for everyone. Okay? And so we needed to come up with a device that functioned more or less the same way as a wheelchair, but was had a different cultural meaning, was distinctive, and didn't mark the user off as disabled, because if it did, nobody would use it. Okay? So here's a picture of Lady Gaga, one of my favorite performing artists. And so here, we of course know that Lady Gaga isn't physically disabled, and nevertheless, she came out on the stage using a wheelchair at one point in some of her performances in Australia. Okay, she was using a mermaid tail, and so that's why she needed to use a wheelchair for mobility. She had a mermaid tail costume on. Okay, and so this question here is, well, how did we know that Lady Gaga wasn't actually disabled, even though she was using a wheelchair? Okay. It seems to me that the use of technology by itself is neither a necessary nor a sufficient condition for actually being disabled, right? It's not a necessary condition because there are plenty of disabled people that don't use it, right? I can remember my grandmother who probably needed a cane far sooner than she actually started using one because of the stigma around it, right? And so she was acquiring a disability around her mobility through aging, and physiologically, it was undeniable that she was, in a sense, physically disabled, and she didn't use this assistive technology to avoid that stigma, right? Sometimes the technology isn't available, right? There are lots of people, especially in developing countries, that don't have access to assistive technology, right? And so that doesn't mean that they're not disabled because they don't use assistive technology. And so you can be disabled without using AT, and so that means that it's not a necessary condition for being disabled. It's also not a sufficient condition, and we know that because of this Lady Gaga example, right? Lady Gaga was not considered disabled when she wheeled herself onto the stage in a wheelchair in 2011, right? And so merely using AT isn't enough to actually make you into a disabled person, okay? However, I want to argue that while it's not enough to actually make you a disabled person, the cultural meaning of disability is enough to make you be perceived as a disabled person. If there's no other counterindication, right? If you don't know who Lady Gaga is and you see her in a wheelchair, then the use of assistive technology is sufficient for conferring the disability identity upon her, right? Using it makes her be perceived as disabled. And that's because of the cultural meaning of the technology itself. Assistive technology is distinct from curative technology because of the cultural meaning it has. And it has the ability, through this meaning, to mark someone off who uses it as disabled. Okay? So I'm going to play a quick video for you. I think that drives home my point. And this is sort of watching this video is what helped me come up with this theory, because people might have watched the Super Bowl this last weekend. I'm recording in mid-February. And if they did, they saw a lot of Super Bowl commercials. So this was a Super Bowl commercial from back in the day when I was a baby philosopher in graduate school. And it is for Guinness beer. And it drives home this point that the use of assistive technology is enough to confer disability identity on the user. And there's other critiques of this, this commercial. It's not sort of a perfect cultural representation of disability by any means, but I think it gets my point across. Okay.
Dedication. Loyalty.
Guys are getting better at this, yeah. Next week, buddy.
Friendship. The choices we make reveal the true nature of our character.
So as you can see from the commercial, right, the shock value of the men playing wheelchair basketball and then standing up to go have a beer with their friend, right? The shock value is due to the fact that using the wheelchair is enough to confer disability identity on 5 of the 6 friends, even though they weren't actually disabled, right? It was the use of the wheelchair to play sports that conferred rather the identity upon them, okay, because of the cultural meaning of the technology itself. So I think I'm going to skip over a little bit of some of these slides for the sake of time, but the idea here is that who we are, right, is that who we are is a function of the stories that we tell about ourselves and that others tell about us. Okay, and this idea is called relational narrative identity. Okay, and so whether or not I am disabled is a function of how I think about myself and how others think about me. Okay, and so it has to do with sort of the cultural meanings of disability in a sense. So assistive technology is any technology that is sort of attached to the narratives that we tell about disability identity. Okay? It's a kind of technology that is culturally significant in the stories we tell about disabled people that constitute the disability social group. Okay? So everything from Captain Hook with his prosthetic arm to Tiny Tim with his cane, right? All of these are technologies that are deeply ingrained in the disability identity. And so if we see someone using those technologies, we say, aha, they must be a disabled person because of the narratives we tell about who disabled people are. Okay? So it's not the case that all technology used by disabled people is assistive technology, right? Like I said, I use an iPhone 11 and I have a disability, but that doesn't mean that it's an assistive technology because I use it, right? Because lots of people use iPhone 11s and they don't confer the disability identity on anybody, right? And so the use of a technology by a disabled person isn't enough to confer the disability identity on that disabled person, right? Um, and so that kind of gets the relationship in reverse, okay? And so this, got me thinking. There's one of my disabilities is that I have a kind of dwarfism, and there's lots of folks with dwarfism that instead of using a scooter or a power wheelchair, they use razor scooters to get around, right? Especially in a crowded city where you're not going to be driving your car and that sort of thing. Okay, so when Razor scooters came out, they became very popular among little people. Okay, and so lots of little people adopted them as a kind of mobility device. And so if a person with dwarfism uses a Razor scooter to get around a city or a university campus, that doesn't make their scooter an assistive device, right? Because the cultural meaning of a Razor scooter isn't the cultural meaning of disability, right? It doesn't confer the disability identity on the person using the Razor scooter, okay? Just like a search engine doesn't become assistive technology when it's used to find funny dog videos, just because the person doing the searching has a service dog, right? And so a disabled person using the technology doesn't make it into assistive technology. Rather, it's the reverse, right? The assistive technology already has the cultural meaning of a disability embedded in it, right? That then confers that identity on the disabled person that uses it and marks them off as disabled, okay? So let's revisit the paradigmatic and hard cases again, okay? In conclusion here, I'm already over time. So my main claim is that in as far as technology confers the disability identity onto its user, it's because of how that technology is associated with this master narrative of disability as a social group, right? That technology holds a particular social meaning that embeds it in the disability identity. And so it's an assistive rather than a curative technology. And so clear cases here, an antibiotic is not something that disabled people and only disabled people use. Chemotherapy, again, is not something that disabled people and only disabled people use, right? It's curative. It removes disability identity. It doesn't confer it. Whereas something like a screen reader or a wheelchair confers disability identity because of its cultural meaning, okay? This also helps with the hard cases, right? Something like a cochlear implant. There's an external portion, and if you know what it looks like when you see someone with hearing loss that has a cochlear implant, you don't say to yourself, there's a hearing person, right? Rather, you say to yourself, there's a deaf person. That's because the cochlear implant confers disability identity on the user, right? The meaning, the social and cultural meaning of the device itself is embedded in the narrative of disability that we all tell to identify disabled people, okay? Achondroplasia gene therapy, right? That one's kind of partially curative, right? When someone uses it on their child, it gets them closer to having a non-disabled status, right? It accelerates the growth of the long bones. It certainly doesn't confer disability identity on the user of the technology, right? And so it's not assistive. It's just sort of partially curative, okay? In the case of bidirectional BCIs, well, it kind of depends how it's used, right? Those can be curative in some cases and assistive in others, depending on the cultural meaning of the device, okay? There are some hard cases of BBCIs that are clearly assistive, right? And so when a person with a spinal cord injury uses a BBCI to control a cursor on a keyboard, right? That's something that confers the disability identity on them. That's not how most people use a cursor on a monitor, right? We usually use a mouse or a keyboard, right? And so if somebody uses a BBCI to do that, that confers disability identity on them, right? Or maybe they use a BBCI to control a prosthetic hand that senses heat to test their infant's bathwater, right? That's a hypothetical case. But again, that would be, at least in our culture, at the present day, right, an example of an assistive technology and not a curative one. Because if you see somebody with a prosthetic hand that's using it to test an infant's bathwater, you don't say to yourself, there's a non-disabled person, right? There you say, there's a disabled person that has a cool assistive device, right? Because the meaning of a prosthetic, the cultural meaning of a prosthetic, is embedded in the narrative of disability and confers the disability identity on the user, just like the wheelchair use of the men in the Guinness commercial conferred disability identity on the basketball players, even though they actually weren't disabled, right? We also have BBCIs that are clearly curative and not assistive, right? That hypothetical that I was talking about the BBCI that's completely internal and reanimates a person's paralyzed limbs, right? Or maybe restores someone's cognitive function by bypassing a brain injury or a lesion on the brain due to stroke or trauma, right? Those would be clearly curative technologies. Why? Because they don't confer disability identity on the user, right? The meaning of the technology isn't embedded in these narratives we tell about who disabled people are, okay? And then finally, there's examples of things that are kind of partially curative, but still not assistive, right? They still don't confer disability identity on the user, right? And so if something cures the symptoms of a person's disability, like when someone uses deep brain stimulation with Parkinson's disease, right? That reduces or even eliminates their tremors. That would be an example of curative technology because you don't see someone with relieved tremors and say to yourself, oh, that person is disabled, right? It moves them farther away rather than closer to the disability identity, okay? Another example might be a BBCI that's used to restore a spinal cord injured person's bladder or bowel control, but doesn't do anything to reanimate their limbs, right? It's certainly not assistive because using it doesn't mark them off as disabled in the same way that a prosthetic limb would or a wheelchair, right? But it's not fully curative either, right? Because they still remain disabled. They still have some limbs that aren't sort of normally functioning, so to speak, right? So that's basically the shape of my talk, where I am trying to work out a distinction between curative and assistive technology so that we then can have even more difficult conversations around which kind of technology to prioritize as we develop new ways of doing things with neuroscience. Thank you.